Why did insane asylums suddenly explode across the Western world in the mid-1800s? Not gradually, not unevenly, but almost all at once. Between roughly 1845 and 1890, enormous psychiatric institutions rose in nearly every major city across Europe and North America. Vast stone complexes, built with impossible speed, designed for thousands and filled almost immediately. Their arrival was abrupt, their scale unprecedented, and their purpose, we are told, humanitarian. Official history offers a neat explanation. Reformers had grown concerned about the treatment of the mentally ill. Moral treatment replaced chains and dungeons. Industrialization strained the human mind. Urbanization, poverty, and modern life produced madness on a scale never seen before. So society responded with care, compassion, and institutions designed to heal. But that explanation collapses under its own weight when examined closely. Because what actually happened does not resemble a gradual reform movement responding to rising need. It resembles something far more urgent, coordinated, reactive. As if these buildings were required quickly, everywhere, for reasons that could not be openly discussed. In 1800, there were perhaps a dozen dedicated psychiatric institutions in all of North America. By 1880, there were more than 300. In Britain, the number rose from around 20 to over 120 in the same period. France, Germany, Russia, each followed the same curve. Italy, Spain, the Austro-Hungarian territories. Different cultures, different governments, different medical traditions. Yet the same sudden explosion of psychiatric infrastructure, compressed into the same narrow historical window. This raises a simple but devastating question. Where did all these patients come from? The standard answer points to industrial capitalism. Factories, railroads, crowded cities. Traditional social structures dissolving. People left unsupported, overwhelmed, and mentally unwell. But the numbers do not align. The asylum boom does not correlate cleanly with industrialization. In some regions, it happens before heavy industry. In others, long after. Rural areas with minimal industrial development constructed asylums just as massive as those in Manchester or New York. Small towns, with populations of 15 or 20,000 people, built institutions designed to hold 2,000 patients. Communities with no factories, no urban density, no visible source of mass psychological collapse. 2,000 beds for a town of 20,000. 1 in 10. The math breaks completely. Unless the patients were not coming from the town itself. Unless they were being collected. Centralized. Unless something else was happening, something the official record refuses to acknowledge. Now consider a parallel timeline that mainstream history treats as unrelated, coincidental, or most often non-existent. Between approximately 1750 and 1850, something happened to cities across the globe. Something that left buildings half buried. Ground floors became basements. Street levels rose. Windows that once opened to streets now opened to soil. Doorways designed for human passage led directly into compacted earth and debris. We call it the Mudflood. St. Petersburg, Paris, London, Boston, San Francisco, Melbourne, Buenos Aires, Edinburgh, Prague, Istanbul. Cities with no shared planning authority, no common engineering standards, no coordinated construction history, yet all displaying the same architectural scars. Ornate first-floor windows now underground. Basement levels with ceiling heights and decorative stonework that make no sense for cellars. Entire neighborhoods sitting 3 to 15 feet lower than surrounding streets. And always the same absence of documentation. No clear records explaining when or why this happened. No large-scale municipal accounts of removing millions of tons of earth. No coherent explanation for how entire cities were partially buried and then simply accepted in their altered state. Roughly 1800 to 1860. The same window in which asylum construction exploded. So let's ask a question that sounds absurd only until you sit with it long enough. If a civilization-altering event occurred, if cities were buried, if populations were displaced, if the physical landscape of the world was rapidly and violently altered, there would have been survivors. People who remembered what came before. People whose memories no longer matched the new official story. People who remembered when those basement windows were ground floor entrances. People who insisted streets were lower, buildings taller, cities different. People who noticed the discontinuity. Who asked why their lived experience contradicted the explanation they were being given. Not criminals. Not revolutionaries. Not dangerous in any conventional sense. Dangerous only in what they remembered. So what do you do with witnesses? How do you silence testimony without executions? Without censorship so obvious it provokes resistance? How do you recast lived memory as error? How do you make reality itself a symptom of illness? You build asylums. And that is where the asylum boom becomes impossible to ignore. Not just because of how many were built, but because of what they were. These were not modest medical facilities. They were monumental containment structures. Massive stone fortresses, often built with the same architectural techniques as the half-buried civic buildings around them. Precision stonework, advanced ventilation systems, symmetrical layouts, monumental scale, craftsmanship that appears inconsistent with the supposed technological capabilities of mid-19th century societies still struggling with basic industrialization. The Kirkbride Plan, introduced in 1854, became the template for asylum construction across North America. Enormous backwing structures, perfect symmetry, long corridors designed for surveillance and separation, built of stone and brick, often on elevated ground. These were not improvised hospitals. They were purpose-built to hold large numbers of people for long periods of time. And here is the strangest detail. Many of these buildings did not appear gradually in the historical record. There are few construction photographs, few detailed progress reports. They seem to emerge fully formed, completed, staffed, and populated almost immediately, as if they had existed before, serving some previous function and were simply repurposed. The patient populations appeared just as suddenly. Admission records describe them vaguely. The wandering poor, persons of unsound mind, individuals without settlement, but rarely detailed diagnoses, rarely personal histories, rarely names connected to families, trades, or prior residences. Just removal, institutionalization, permanent separation from society, and the language is careful, avoiding specifics, as if the true reasons for commitment could not be written down. What makes this pattern harder to dismiss is that it was not regional. It was global. Britain passes the Lunacy Act in 1845, mandating asylum construction in every county. France enacts similar legislation the same year. In the United States, state after state passes commitment laws throughout the 1840s and 1850s. Russia, Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all implementing psychiatric institutionalization on an unprecedented scale. Japan, with no prior tradition of institutional psychiatry, begins building Western-style asylums in the 1870s. The Ottoman Empire follows suit. Even colonial territories in Africa and Asia see asylum construction, often before basic hospitals or schools. All at once. All without acknowledging coordination. The official explanation calls this convergent evolution. Similar problems producing similar solutions. Progressive ideas spreading through journals and conferences. But convergent evolution does not produce identical architecture. It does not produce identical legal language. It does not produce simultaneous construction timelines across societies with radically different cultures, economies, and political systems. It does not explain why a small rural town in Pennsylvania and a provincial city in Siberia would build nearly identical institutions in the same decade, using the same design principles for the same stated purpose. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And that is only the beginning. To understand what the asylums were truly for, we have to look at what qualified someone to be placed inside them. Because the explosion of psychiatric institutions was matched by an equally dramatic expansion of what counted as insanity. Before the 1840s, madness was a narrow category. It referred to extreme conditions, violent psychosis, profound cognitive collapse, states so severe they could not be ignored. Commitment was relatively rare, controversial, and usually temporary. Families hesitated. Authorities hesitated. The threshold was high. Then, almost overnight, the definition changed. Between roughly 1840 and 1880, psychiatric diagnosis expanded at an astonishing rate. Behaviors and beliefs that would have been considered eccentric, inconvenient, or socially disruptive in earlier generations were suddenly reclassified as symptoms of mental illness requiring institutional care. The boundaries dissolved. Madness became elastic. Religious enthusiasm could qualify. Political radicalism could qualify. Unconventional beliefs. Social nonconformity. Moral insanity. A diagnosis so vague it could be applied to anyone who challenged prevailing norms. Nostalgia, literal homesickness, was listed as a committable condition. Drapetomania, the supposed illness that caused enslaved people to flee captivity, was seriously proposed and published in medical literature. Monomania, obsessive focus on a single topic, became grounds for institutionalization. And strikingly often that topic was history. Architecture. The past. Surviving case files are unsettling not because of how disturbed the patients appear, but because of how thin the justifications often were. A woman who claimed her city used to look different. A man who insisted he remembered buildings that no longer existed. People describing streets at different levels, entrances where there was now earth, windows that once opened onto air. Individuals who could not reconcile the buried first floors with the explanations they were being given. People asking why so many structures showed signs of sudden burial. Why the historical record felt discontinuous. Why their lived memories no longer aligned with official accounts. The doctor's conclusions repeat with uncanny consistency. Delusional. Confabulating. Suffering from false memories. Temporal disorientation. Detached from reality. These terms appear again and again in asylum records from the 1840s through the 1870s. Not sporadically, systematically, as if a template were being applied. But what if their reality was not false? What if it simply contradicted a newly imposed narrative? This is where the evidence becomes absence, where the pattern reveals itself not through what survives, but through what is missing. Try to find detailed first-person accounts from asylum patients during this period. Their own words, their own explanations of what they believed and why. Their descriptions of the world as they remembered it. Unfiltered, untranslated, uninterpreted. They are vanishingly rare. When patient testimony does exist, it is almost always mediated, transcribed by staff, interpreted through diagnostic frameworks, preserved only when it reinforces the conclusion of madness. Direct patient writings were frequently destroyed, deemed therapeutically counterproductive, or classified as meaningless products of disordered minds. Dismissal, however, is not proof of falsehood. The deeper one looks into asylum archives, the more disturbing the gaps become. Admissions with no accompanying documentation of previous lives. Individuals institutionalized with no clear family connections, no employment history, no records of residence. Names without context. identities without origin, just a date of admission, a vague description of symptoms, a diagnosis, and then silence, as if these people appeared from nowhere, or as if their previous existence had been erased, as if records had been deliberately purged, as if they were never meant to be traceable beyond the walls of the institution. What haunts is not what the records say, it is what they refuse to say. There is no discussion in 19th century medical literature of contradiction. No acknowledgement that something unusual is happening. The sudden explosion of mental illness is treated as natural, expected, unremarkable. Medical journals do not ask why psychiatric pathology appears to be increasing exponentially. Public health officials do not investigate the cause of this apparent epidemic. Thousands of people across Europe and North America are suddenly going mad, requiring permanent institutionalization, exhibiting remarkably similar symptoms centered on memory disruption, temporal confusion, and insistence that the physical world has changed. And the response is not curiosity, not epidemiological study, not investigation into why this specific cluster of symptoms appears simultaneously across vast geographic distances, not inquiry into whether an external event might be responsible. The response is commitment, containment, silence, immediate institutionalization, permanent separation from society, and a striking lack of medical interest in the phenomenon itself. The asylums filled. The questions stopped. And slowly the mud flood became myth. The witnesses became patients. The testimony became symptoms. And the insistence on remembering became evidence of illness. Return again to the buildings themselves. Many 19th century asylums show the same half-buried characteristics as other structures from the era. First floors below ground level. Windows opening directly into soil. Foundations suggesting either construction on recently elevated ground or burial after completion. The Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia. The Athens Lunatic Asylum in Ohio. All show architectural features that mirror those found in civic buildings, churches, and train stations from the same period. Features that suggest rapid environmental disruption. But unlike other monumental structures, asylums were rarely celebrated. They were not showcased as architectural achievements. They did not dominate public imagination. They were built, filled, and quietly normalized. No grand opening ceremonies. No architectural journals praising their craftsmanship. Just functional notices and immediate patient intake. And when these institutions were abandoned in the 20th century, as psychiatric care shifted toward different models, another pattern emerged. The records vanished. Patient testimonies, admission documents, daily logs, case files. Decades of documentation that should have existed for institutions housing thousands of people over generations. Destroyed, lost, rendered inaccessible. Explained away as fire damage, water damage, routine disposal of outdated medical records. The destruction often occurred just before the buildings were repurposed or demolished, just before independent researchers might gain access, as if someone did not want those records surviving into an era capable of re-examining them. Again, the silence is louder than any confession. No centralized authority admits to coordination. No document orders global psychiatric containment. There is no single piece of paper that proves intent. But the pattern remains. Simultaneous expansion of diagnostic categories. Uniform legal frameworks enabling involuntary commitment. Identical architectural designs appearing across continents. Immediate filling of institutions before local populations could plausibly generate the need. This is not how humanitarian reform unfolds. This is how emergency infrastructure is deployed. As if someone knew in advance that large numbers of people would need to be removed from public life. As if the institutions were not built in response to madness, but in anticipation of it. Or more precisely, in anticipation of memory. And once those memories were contained, pathologized, and silenced, the world could move forward under a revised history. Streets were always this high. Buildings were always like this. There was no disruption, no catastrophe, no before, only progress. And anyone who said otherwise was ill. I cannot prove what happened. No single document survives that explains it all. There is no signed order mandating global silence. No confession preserved in an archive. What exists instead is a pattern so consistent that coincidence becomes mathematically implausible. The synchronicity, the scale, the timing. The asylum boom did not unfold gradually. It detonated. Massive institutions were constructed with astonishing speed, using architectural methods that mirrored an older, supposedly non-existent era. They appeared almost simultaneously across continents, filled immediately, and then faded quietly into the background of history. And they appeared precisely when the physical world shows signs of having been violently altered. If the mud flood, or some event like it, was real, it would explain far more than half-buried buildings. It would explain the sudden disorientation, the temporal confusion, the insistence among many individuals that the world they remembered no longer matched the world they were shown. It would explain why memory itself became suspicious. Because memory is dangerous when it contradicts authority. Look again at the commitment criteria that emerged during this period. False memories, temporal dislocation, confabulation, delusions centered on historical inconsistency. These were not fringe diagnoses. They were standardized, codified, repeated. Symptoms that sound disturbingly like testimony. People saying, "This isn't how it used to be." People insisting, "Something happened." People refusing to accept that buried architecture was always meant to be buried. And instead of investigation, the response was medicalization. To declare someone insane is not merely to disagree with them. It is to invalidate their perception of reality. It is to strip testimony of credibility without addressing its content. To render their words meaningless by definition. Once labeled, nothing they say needs to be answered. This is an extraordinarily efficient form of erasure. No public trials. No executions. No mass graves. Just diagnosis, commitment, and time. And time did the rest. Generations passed. The asylums closed. The buildings decayed or were demolished. The records vanished. The witnesses died inside institutions, separated permanently from society. Their memories died with them. And what remained was the official story. Humanitarian reform. Progressive care. The triumph of medical science over superstition. But the architectural evidence does not align with that narrative. The legal synchronicity does not align. The sudden appearance of identical institutions across unrelated cultures does not align. The immediate filling of these structures does not align. The systematic destruction of records does not align. And perhaps most telling of all, the refusal to even ask these questions does not align. Why does mainstream historical inquiry treat this correlation as unmentionable? Not merely incorrect but unreasonable. Not wrong but absurd. Why is the question itself dismissed before evidence is examined? That is not how confident explanations behave. That is how protected narratives behave. Consider the logistics. To erase a civilization, or even a chapter of one, you cannot rely on censorship alone. You cannot rely on violence without leaving traces.